Well, hello everybody. This is Fine Art Studio 3D. I'm going to do a little tutorial on you on cutting and scoring and all the rest, some of the things that are involved with the folding garden project. So I just have this handout that's an old one because you've got the various handouts and instructions for the exercises in PDFs in your Moodle module, and I'll be dealing with talking about it beyond this. This is primarily to deal with measuring and marking and cutting of the project. I won't talk too much about the design, and I'm going to try and keep a fairly good pace so that this doesn't run into like an hour long or something like that. I have pre-marked and measured some things in advance, but I'm going to kind of work my way through. Got a few implements here. I've got my nice 18-inch metal ruler. Again, any ruler will do, but this is a nice one for doing this kind of thing. It's not as long as the paper, you can see, but I'll show you something to do with that right off the bat. This is just a standard X-Acto knife. It's blue, very nice. It's got a number 11 blade, pointy. It's nice and sharp. I just put a fresh one in there. And of course, some of you may choose to use one or other variation of the, what we call a snap blade knife. You'll notice the little lines across this side. Those are score lines, much like we're going to be scoring. And the first thing I'm going to say, keep it in your head as a mantra all the way through. Always fold or break away from the score. Now I broke this off in class. It's a nice fresh blade and I don't want to waste it. But for those who weren't there for that one, as I say, most of these style cutting knives have a little butt end like that slides out. And if I click this all the way back, I won't do it right now, but I did it before. You can see there's a little blue knob there, and it goes through a hole in this blade. If I slide this all the way out, when the blade is broken down to its last bits, I can put a fresh blade in this in here, because you can buy packs of 10 and such for this. But when you take that out, it has a I'm doing things backwards already and not even related to the video. It has a little slot in it. Can't see it all that well, but basically, as you can see, I'm sliding it onto the blade, and if I go to the side with the score, I can't even tell. I'm looking through the camera. There we go, that side. So I slide it in there, and I simply fold away from the score or snap away from the score. That means with the score on this side, you're always folding away from the score rather than binding onto it. But this isn't the score line, it's just a break line, but pip, snaps off, and this helps keep that blade controlled. Of course, it's a knife, it's very sharp, and so be careful with it. And if you are breaking that blade off, sometimes people will push it down on something and snap it like that, and it can go flying. So watch your eyes if you're snapping blades and doing things like that, and retract it when you're not using it. These often have caps to protect them as well, but I lose all the caps. In any case, got that standard HB pencil. I'll give it a quick sharpen back here. Just as with your knife blades, you want to keep your pencil sharp so that the lines are thin and accurate. And as I say, I'm starting with fresh blades. If you've got a freshly snapped blade or a brand new X-Acto blade in there, that should do the job for this entire project with all your cutting and scoring. But the thing to be aware of is if your blade starts to get dull, the risk is that it's going to, at some point shred the paper and produce a ragged edge that you don't want. This project, while there are some design considerations, it is primarily about following instructions, measuring, marking, accurately cutting, folding, and etc. And then we'll get to gluing and such later. That'll be another discussion or demonstration. And everything needs to be neat, tidy, no marks, no glue all over the outsides of things and so forth. And so I've got a nice cutting mat here. As you can see, it's a self-healing cutting mat. That's great to have because it doesn't have any fibers or things like papers, the things that dull the knives. So when you're cutting in this, it's not dulling the knife too much. I mean, anytime you cut something, cut into it, it's dulling it somewhat, but not like paper does, because paper is full of fibers and so forth. So that's helpful. And it also, because it's self-healing, it's not, the more you cut on it, it doesn't get cut up as quickly and rough. If you're using a piece of Bristol board or something like that, as often people do, because you don't want to cut up your nice dining room table or something like that by cutting through paper on it. A piece of Bristol board or something smooth that's not going to interrupt the cut. But after a while of cutting on that, that does get kind of cut up, and it can lead to issues when you're trying to do precise cuts. You hit a rut, and it kind of makes a bubble along an edge and so forth. So if you're using one of those, replace it with a new piece of Bristol or something like that periodically. So this is a full half sheet, I guess then it's a half sheet, not a full sheet, of vellum. And for those who've come into the college to pick up materials, you've got 4 of these. That should be more than enough for all your exercises and all the parts of geometric parts that I will show you about later on in this video. When you're laying out on this, try to keep things neat and tidy and close, so that you do make the most use of the paper. Keep cutoffs. They can be useful for practicing on. What else? As I said, the other advantage of a cutting mat, it's got this nice grid, so I can check and see that that this is nice and square, because I'm going to be measuring off the edges of the paper, and if this paper isn't square, then nothing that I measure off of it will be square. But now, while I often will tell people, don't even trust factory cut papers to be square and nice. Generally this vellum is, and I've checked it, and it is as well. But the pieces that you will have gotten at home, I'm going to fold this up a bit, and well, we probably won't see. It's a little delicate in here, but you'll notice that this top edge, there's a slight raggedness there. And that is because I cut it in half, and I used our rotary cutter, which is getting a little bit dull. And so sometimes when I'm cutting 4 or 5 sheets at a time, because I don't want to sit there and cut, one at a time when I'm giving out 50 sheets of paper or something like that, sometimes it'll be a little ragged on the side that's been cut. So if you check your sheets and you look all along the edge and you see a little bit of raggedness in a place, that's probably my cut. Now, it may be nice and square, but it also is quite possibly going to be out just a little bit. But when we get into the folding parts of the geometric shapes, just the tiniest amount out can lead to a sequence of events where you've got 4 folds to do, and each fold is out a 32nd of an inch or something like that, and suddenly the thing is skewed and it doesn't fit. So I mentioned a 32nd of an inch, and some of you are like, oh my, I don't even know what an inch is. We do have some people who haven't, gotten into rulers and things too much yet. Is that 6th and 12th? Of course, my ruler has all kinds of different markings on it. It's got picas and various things. But most of you will have a ruler that has, like this top edge, a standard inch that is broken up into halves, quarters, eighths, sixteenths, and so forth. And if I can just get this in here, I'm going to turn my light a bit and hope it doesn't reflect too much. So there you can see that I'll go up here by the 2 because of that hole in there, which has its own purpose. So you can basically see the longest lines in the inch are, where the 2 and the 3 are, and in the middle, that's the ½ inch, right? So those long lines that extend inward like that, they generally mark those ½ inch intervals. And of course, the inch point itself at 2, 3 is marked with a number as well. then you'll notice that there's some lines that are slightly shorter than those middle lines. So that's a 1/2 inch, right? Halfway between the 2 and 3, 1/2 inch. Now, halfway between that 1/2 inch mark and, the 2 is 1/4 inch, right? And so that's slightly shorter line. And then the next shorter line in between there, 1/4 is an 1/8, 1/8 is a 1/16, and then some rulers down in that bottom inch or places elsewhere on them will have more and more lines. Well, we won't confuse you. And those goes to 32nds, 64ths, and so forth. Yes, I still use imperial measure, just like the construction industry tends to, carpenters and that still often will use this rather than centimeters and so forth. In any case, that's what your measurements are broken down to. You shouldn't have too much where you have to use eighths and things like that. It's in any case, there you go. You're going to be making use of a ruler and marking and measuring things here. So now, the first thing, this piece I'm just going to do one cut on. It's got a little mark on it. So I'm going to do just one long cut because if you've got a piece like this and you're going to be cutting various things out of it, before we get to patterns, you also have to cut the 8.5 by 8.5 inch squares that you will be doing the exercises on. We'll go over those sheets and I'll refresh your memory, but they're not too complex. Again, I've pre-drawn so you can see. We'll get to them. So these are 8.5 by 8.5, and you can get a couple of sheets out of one of these, and then you got enough room to do a couple more sheets off the other side or off of this line, because this will be the straight, and remember the ragged one is up here, so we'll leave that as a cutoff. You'll also have a couple of small cutoffs about this shape, which is a nice size because you can practice doing some of your circle cutting, doing some scoring. I highly recommend practicing your scoring and just trying out some of the different manipulations that you intend to do to see how it works and looks, and just to get a feel for things. So now, when you want to cut this off, you've got this long cut to do here, and what I've done is I've pre-marked, barely up there we are, I've pre-marked, I measured 8.5 inches up. Now I want this to be nice and square, and so, as I say, I'm trusting the factory edge to be square, and I've checked it and it is. And some of you won't have this nice grid thing to work from. Plus, this ruler doesn't go all the way from side to side anyway, so I couldn't, get from the grid to the grid to get it lined up with this. So what do? Well, you just measure and mark in multiple places. So what I've done is I've measured up 8.5 inches from the bottom edge and marked right up on the left there. And then I've done the same thing in the middle, which is not more than the 18 inches that my ruler can run. And I've also measured and marked up 8.5 up at the far side, because I'm going to have to move the ruler across as I go. It's always, ideal if you can make your cut without having to shift or move the ruler. Try to always keep your knife moving at a steady pace. And but we will have to move, and if you have to move, as I say, be very careful that you don't change the angle or shift things. Now, you can just see where I am over there. I'm going to start up on that side because I'm standing up here to stay out of your way. And basically, I am lining up on the far over there. If you can't see it, I am getting on that line, and then I'm lining it up with this one. And if I've been pretty accurate, this will line up all the way across to here. Now, as I say, you have to watch, with your hold one, make sure your fingertip doesn't stick out over here. I'm going to cut with the click blade knife for you just to show that it actually works. You don't want to come along and zip your finger. And it's good to spread your hand like this and keep this from rotating. If there's anything under there, it's very easy for the ruler to slide or shift as you're cutting, and you don't want that happening because then you start to. So again, I am going to, I really should be cutting, you know, so that the good piece, which I consider this to be, is on this side, but then I'm also wanting to cut another piece right off of that. So I'm just going to trust that I can do this without, you know, screwing up. Now, the other rule when you're cutting is always cut underhand, like we do, like I say, draw underhand for gesture drawing, is cut underhand, cut on a low angle, right? If you're starting to cut like this, if you're trying to cut, that blade's just fighting to get through. It's going to cut more smoothly and have a little more surface that it's got to go on here if you've got a nice low angle. And as I say, you're trying to use enough pressure to cut all the way through this in one pass. So I'm firmly pressing down, staying tight to the edge of the ruler, going at a steady pace, and going all the way almost to the end. And then I'm just going to slow down and stop. And I'm not even going to lift the knife out of there. I'm just going to slide my way along, line it up with that mark, see that it's lined up and straight along the cut all the way to the other middle mark. Get that one lined up again. See, there's a great risk that it, you know, just a little skew can put this out of whack. So there I go, and I've cut that off. Now, you know, if you need, as I say, you'll need 3 sheets. So, you know, this one is a little more than an 8.5, but I would do the same thing. I would measure up from here, 8.5, put my 3 marks, and cut this one as well. But I don't need it, so to save time, I'm just going to put it aside. And then, as I say, you're just doing the same thing over here. Now, I'm not, well, I can do it really quickly. May as well. So now, this side is also squared. I've checked. So now I'm going to just mark lightly here, 8.5 and 8.5. And then cut that off, and I've got a nice fresh square piece. I'll go around over on this side of the table here. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. There was something I was going to mention while I'm just getting this last bit. I should double check. See, there's a bit of a shadow here because I've got a side light going on. Anyways, try and make sure your lighting is good and all of that business. If you're cutting heavier material, like if you're cutting Bristol board, or even heavier like a mat board or illustration board, it can be difficult to cut through in one pass. In cases where you're working with heavy materials, don't try and bear down and hard enough to cut through in one pass. Just line up and go, not super lightly but firmly, but just make several passes and cut through that way. All right. General principle. I'll put this over here. And now, so that's basically cutting. And I'm going to cut out another shape later and show you some other cutting things. But that just covers the basics of measuring and cutting and getting your blanks ready for the exercises. Now, I'm going to sit down here a moment. As I said, I will discuss the design of these various ones. I've modified this, you know, I've done a variety of things with this, but this is the first exercise, which is called rhythmic pleating, and it's very simple and quick. I'm going to do the whole thing, you know, here for you now. That's how quick it is, really. But basically, I've done a layout, and as I say, the layout just basically says go from side to side, and create a series of rhythmic lines that play off one another in one fashion or another, and then you're going to alternate sides that you score on and basically accordion fold this thing so we get the effect like we saw in the sample PDF. I'll go over those samples again, you know, so we've got something relative to this to see. So the thing with all of these, again, make sure your cutting board or whatever you're working on is nice and clean, that your hands are clean, because the paper can get marked up quite easily, and try not to rumple it or crinkle it, because as we see in the sample images, just the slightest rumple shows up in especially if you're lighting it, like a light box, in a light box or something. So you can vary the distance. I have done so in this, and I mean you can be regimented where it gets wider and wider, or narrower, or it goes back and forth, much like this does. Again, rhythmic, lines will often we're considering them in relative to one another. So, they can start to push and move across. You can get more organic and, as I say, curving. There's a certain amount of curvature that you can't really go beyond. You could probably get tighter curves than this, but at the same time, if you try it, test on a test piece of paper, if you start getting, too much curvature, it's really not going to work. There's only so much that the paper can take before it starts to, just twist and get marked up. Anyhow, as I said, some of these lines here I haven't, really. They're somewhat contrary to one another. That can create an interesting effect, or I could have come across here and had these slowly pushing one another, to appear as though they're slowly shifting one to the next. But I just thought I'd show a variety, and because sometimes it can be quite nice to have something where there's a bit of contrary effect to the things. Anyhow, there we are, and I'm going to score this. And that's all that's going to end, and it's not going to take long. I'll move around the end. I'll actually move this a little further this way and slide over here without touching the corner of the phone and shutting it off again. And now the thing with this is we have to do an accordion fold, and that's sort of one will go that way and one will go this way, back and forth. Now, remember what I said at the beginning is always fold away from the score. That means, as instructed on that handout, is you have to score alternate sides. So anytime we're drawing on these, we consider that to be the back. So we've got the whole design laid out on the back. And you want to remember that, when I turn this over, you see, I wanted to create a design that swept up and to the right, so I drew it backwards. It doesn't matter too much with this. You can just lay it out and see what you get when you turn it over. But, and it'll probably be balanced and just fine. But some designs don't reverse well. You draw it backwards for a lino cut, or you draw a lino cut and just put it on like that, and then you print it and it comes up backwards, and the design is completely different looking than you want, and maybe something is out of whack with the composition now because of that. But let's not worry about that. As I say, I did take it into consideration so that I want an upward sweeping thing when I flip it over to the other side. But I don't want to draw on the other side. So here's what works with this one. So what I'm going to do is cut each alternating one. Now, you can even, just to make sure, and don't draw too dark, but this paper is fairly heavy, so you won't see through. I'm going to put a little X on every second one so I don't forget as I go. I could have drawn less lines here so that it wouldn't take as long, but at the same time, I didn't want to suggest that people should just do 3 of these. It's up to you how many, right? Again, but as I say now, the other thing, and I'm going to do it as well, because I haven't done any of this in a year, I guess. So you need to sometimes practice your scoring. What scoring is doing is lightly cutting the surface of the paper. You're cutting some of the fibers, and that's going to make it fold in a nice, crisp line. Now, in this case, it's a curving, just a hand-cut line. If you're cutting any straight lines, make sure you cut with the ruler. But I'm just testing my way around for this, so I'm also being fluid. And that's the other thing. We've got a line there to draw. It isn't perfect, and I'm not going to sit there and try and cut exactly. I can see I've pushed that out of the way, remember? I'm not going to sit there and try and cut exactly on the line. I'm going to try and be near the line, but be even more smooth and fluid than that line is. I hope I was in the thing. If I wasn't, well, this is my reminder. But there you go. So I was just testing anyway. So this is the real deal here. And I'll make sure I stay in the camera range for this one. I'll tilt it a little bit more in case I slide that way as I go. Because again, you have to kind of sometimes make sure that you're aware of where you're going, right? It's like scope out the whole line, whether it's cutting with a ruler or a circle. It has its own considerations. You don't want to start and then find yourself in an awkward position as you get to the end where you come off of the thing. So once again, I'm cutting every alternating line, and I'm just loosely using those lines as a guide. If I start to get off, I'm not going to be too worried about it. I'm more worried about staying fairly fluid. So now, and also keeping my cut weight or score weight sufficient, but not so firm that the thing falls apart or half apart. Oop, almost cut the wrong one there. That kind of goes with measure twice, cut once. Same thing with cutting lines. Sort of double check before you start. I may tend to rush as I do this because, as you know, when I'm doing these kinds of things, I can go on for seemingly inordinate amounts of time. So I'm trying to be speedy but thorough. So now what I'm doing is all of those scores, I'm going to give them a quick fold, and you can see I've got my weight good because they're easy to fold but not falling apart. Don't work them back and forth too much because then they could. So I'm just going to cut this. We'll get this done here. Am I in range? Here we are. I started my score, and I'm just cutting that like that. This one was a fairly narrow pair. And we'll just do a little wiggle in some of these to see how they relate to one another. And there. So now these ones fold the other direction. And that's it. The project is done. Exercise 1. And so, we'll deal with photographing and doing things, but basically what I want to do is get all the folds. And remember, with a lot of these things, people start to get excessive and try and fold and get too much, too too open or too projecting, and much more than necessary. So I'm giving them a little extra folding to stick out, but then gonna let it flatten down so that it looks comfortable and sits there. And I'll hold it up. See, I've got various kinds of lighting going on. You can see how they change depending on the light direction. So I'm going to point that light away and tip this up. So there is rhythmic pleating. I guess that's about the best light. When I look at these, we tend to use a light box that's lighting it right from above. And so anything that's horizontal or on a diagonal, but generally more horizontal than vertical, is going to pick up light much more dramatically in that lighting situation. This, I've got light coming from the window that direction, so it's quite dramatic as well. So it all depends on the lighting change, but that is the rhythmic pleating exercise. It's nice and quick and simple, and as I say, a little bit of practice on a cutoff is going to help you, as I say, be fluid with your cuts. Try to control that cutting pressure so you don't cut through and have it flapping from some of the edges or cuts and so forth. So there, that's that one. Now, let's move on to the circles. So now, as I say, the examples that I showed, I had ovals as well, but I'd say stick with circles. But if anybody really wants to try and draw some ovals in there, they can. I'm going to get my other light back up here. And so I've only drawn 4 circles. in here, but again, you're asked to fit 15 to 20 with a maximum size of 1.5 inches, and that is 1.5 inch circle. And going down to as small as you can go. You don't want to get too much smaller than 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit, but then they start to get real fussy to cut and curl as well. I did, of course, use a compass for this, but you don't have to. You could just sketch out your circles and as I say, use this kind of a gesture study and say, okay, I want a circle about this big, and kind of lightly sketch it in there, and then more resolutely kind of smooth out the edges and that, and get it looking as round as possible. If you were doing that, as I say, it's not going to be as perfect as these, but at the same time, if they're all a sort of organic circle that's, just, then it's not going to look too bad. Now, you'll notice what else I've done here, and I'll raise this up so we can see it. And again, we've got the design. This is the back. So if you wanted, I'll bring that in a minute. So when I turn this over after it's cut to do the curling, everything's going to be backwards again. And the design on this is to just sort of randomly arrange the circles so that they're in a nice, comfortable arrangement. There can be more space here and there. You can cluster some. And 15 to 20 will fill the page. You want to stay away. I think I give 1/2 inch from the edge. Try not to get too close to the edges. You don't want to weaken it. And also, it's going to create a visual pinch if you get too close to the edges. Try not to put any too close to one another either. And definitely don't consider, overlapping. We can't really do that. I mean, there's ways you could suggest it, but keep them all separated from one another. And if you did want to, really consider what your final layout's going to be, and not draw it in reverse. So I replicated this here, where if I was drawing away and saying, okay, this is the arrangement I want here, and you can imagine the rest is done, then I'm just looking over and, visually sort of saying, okay, if this top left one, that's going to be over on the top right here now, and then this one's going to be that. So I've just done like a little thumbnail that sort of shows me my reverse, and then I've followed roughly that arrangement to lay this out. But once again, you can get away with, for this project, because it's not as design heavy, it's more about, the cutting and neatness and all of that, as I said, you can just lay it out like this and do your cutting and scoring. So now the next thing I did, and if you hand draw these, you're also just going to kind of find this roughly the center, and again use a ruler or whatever, find the center by eye, but as you may not be able to see because the line's there, because I've used the compass, there's a very tiny hole in the center, so that made it easy to just, draw my axis line. Now, what happens here is, because we're not just cutting this thing full of holes, we're going to be curling these pieces, and so we're basically cutting 2 semicircles, and we're leaving a small amount. It can vary. I put a specific amount, but basically a little more on the larger ones. That's maybe 3/16 or whatever, not quite a 1/4 inch, and a little smaller on the smaller ones, on either side of that axis line. And that's to remind me, stop cutting. If I cut past that and cut past that, then these things are going to be dangling out of there. So that's basically just to remind me to stop cutting. I'm going to sit right here on this side, so I may bungle around a little bit. But once again, with this one, as I said, be aware of where you stop and start. If you just sort of, if I go like this and say, okay, I'm cutting from here to here, and I start cutting like this, I'm going to not be able to turn unless I'm standing and can move my body, or I can move the paper. So usually what I do is I kind of make it like a spring, where I'm going to start cutting in a slightly awkward position. And of course, I've also got issues with my lights and things, because normally you're not doing this with a camera. But I'm starting up here sort of upside down, so that by the time I swing around to here, it's in a more natural position, but I may still need to move the paper a little bit, or I would really like to just move my body, but I've got a big stupid light thing in my way. So, you know, I'll see how well I do, but you'll have a little more freedom if you don't have a light. Because again, you want to kind of follow the line and stay going steady and don't stop. And we're cutting weight, and as I say, if you get a little off, that's all right, kind of keep going. Don't stop and create. I'm kind of turning the paper. You can slow down, but don't stop and change angles. So there, you can see I've missed the line a little bit here, gone a little above it there. But as long as it's smooth and nice, you know, it should work. It should be okay. I'll do the other one just because. So once again, I've started somewhat upside down. I'm in my own light here again. As I say, probably you can't even see that. Yeah, see, there we go. So if you have to stop at some point, I've stopped here, but I've kept my knife in there, and I'm going to try and, you know, make sure that I don't take off in a different direction, right? So there we go. Did stop at that spot. All right. So now you can see I've cut through, and the curling part is pretty simple. And you don't, again, this is where you don't want to be aggressive, because you get, as you saw in the sample ones, they'd have all these folds there. And that's because people think they're making a bowl to put their cereal in or something, right? It doesn't take much. So a little bit of just grabbing on either side and giving it a pinch, not too far. And sometimes just massaging that to kind of soften it. You can see it even then, just a little bit. It's getting a little bit rumpled, but that tends to happen a little bit more with this one. So I've massaged the paper to kind of stretch the fibers in there, but not bend them. And then give it another little squeeze like that, and then leave it at that, right? That's, again, if I take my light and move it, you know, so that we're just getting a light from the distance, you can see how when it's top lit, with the light from the window there, that picks up, you know, nicely. And this isn't so open, you shouldn't, you know, like we're seeing under that because we're looking at it from the bottom angle. But when we raise it up, you know, generally we're not seeing through. You want to avoid any of it when the squares, etc., etc. You don't want to curl this thing way up and have it sitting there where I can look through the paper. All right, so once again, you can see that now that I started to squeeze it and try and curl it up more, you've got some mark there that's just slightly, you know, showing a little bit of a fold almost. Not bad though, not bad. You know, if you hand something in with a little bit of that, there's going to be a little bit of that, but you're trying to be as neat and tidy as possible. And this one does tend to have a little bit of that go on with it. But that's the idea, is that it's, you know, it's just capturing light like this sphere. And so then you'll continue on. You wouldn't do your curling with each one, you know, do all your cutting, all of these first. And now, as I said, the axis I got going is you decide what the axis is. As I say, if you think of a certain area as the top, generally speaking, you know, as I said, horizontals, the horizontals are going to pick up a more dramatic shadow than the side. So a lot of times you're keeping, you know, these axes on somewhat more towards the horizontal rather than an all vertical. But, you know, again, it becomes your part of your decision is what is the character of this piece, right? Do you want to have, you know, all horizontal throughout some areas and then, you know, all verticals, so there's sort of both going on, or diagonals shifting this way and that. So those determine, you know, another aspect of the look as well. So, and that's something that you can plan out when you're just doing your drawing section. So that's exercise number 2. Not done in this case because I haven't cut my 15 to 20 circles. And so that people who are confident can go ahead and continue on with the third and final exercise for homework along with the first two, but I also sort of say if you're not entirely confident with it and you just want to kind of maybe get your layout done, oh yes, before I start cutting it, I've got to talk about laying it out. So I guess I do have to do it. So I'll keep going with that part, then I'll stop, and then when we come back, we'll take up talking just briefly about cutting it, and we'll also do talk about these forms, because that's what I deal with in the class after this one, I guess I would say. Because when we come back for week 3, I guess it would be, as I say, some people may have this layout done but haven't cut it, or they may be struggling with it and want to ask some questions again or review this this tutorial. And you know, I cover this, make sure people are up to speed to do that, and I demonstrate these forms, and then the rest, you know, is over to you and to spend the next couple of weeks creating the forms. And you do have to do more than just those, but in any case. So now, let me get my light back up here. So this does give some people fits, but I say, in fact, when we give the handout, you know, the idea was that people had to figure it out for themselves, use their problem solving. I didn't print the handout out, but we'll go over it. But as it says, it's basically divide your 8.5 by 8.5 square into a symmetrical grid of 16 1.5 inch squares. And, you know, leave enough space between them, etc., etc. And you're creating a 4x4 grid of 16 squares. And so that's that. But I've had people say, I've spent 40 minutes trying to draw this up, I'm going to lose my mind. So what I did do is I obviously drew this, but as you know, from the first big paper cutting, we cut this band off and we cut it, so these were nice and square, right? So I don't need the grid on this or anything, but I mean, it's helpful for measuring and marking it out, but nonetheless, so I know that this paper is square on all the edges, and basically what you have to do is measure and mark all the way across the whole paper, just lines across each edge, and connect them up. Right? Now, I'm going to write in here, and so you can refer it or take a note of it, or I'll write it into the Moodle module as well, because it's pretty simple, because, oh, here we go. I'll do it there. So basically what we were asking people to do is they go, okay, 16 squares in a 4x4 grid, 1.5 inches per square. So there's 4 across a direction here. That's 6 inches. That leaves me with 2.5 inches. So you say, okay, 2.5 inches. And now I've got the 4 squares, and I've got 1, 2, 3 spaces in between, and then the outside edge on either side. That's a half an inch. Oh, doesn't that work nicely? These were 9 by 9 squares last, always before this, so it involved a little more. This made it I made it easier. Also made it so that it'll fit on 8.5 by 11 paper if you have to use get your own. And again, if you can't get the vellum, if you've got a heavier drawing pad, that's got that kind of a thickness to it, that works well. Cover stock would work okay. In a pinch, you could just use printer paper, 24 pound at least, please. If you're cutting it on a 20 pound, you're going to have a real super delicate score kind of cut, because it'll be that's the main problem. If you're using a really lightweight paper, it'll be very easy to cut through too far, or if you're trying to curl things or things like that, it'll get a rumple in it in no time. In any case, but whatever, I will take that into account. If somebody can't get the right material, I will look and say, how difficult would it have been to cut that material? So there it is. If you're referring to this video later, 16 4x4 squares, 1.5 inches each. That uses up 6 inches of space. The extra 2.5 inches divides up nicely into the 5 areas of border, in between, and border. And so then what I've done is come with my ruler and go all the way around the outside, all 4 outside edges and measure and mark it. I've done it, but I'm going to just sort of pretend I'm doing it here now. 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches. 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches. 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches. 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches. And, you know, got to do a little bit of sort of add, you know, you put a mark at 1/2 inch, then, you know, you say, okay, 1.5 inches goes to 2. Right? And then you say, okay, now 1/2 inch, mark it, that's 2.5. So 1.5 inches is going to take you to 4. So there you go. So you do one side, you do the other side, and you turn it this way, you do this side, you do the top side, and then you just go all the way along and connect all of those together. And then you've got your grid, square, and I've done a couple of things in there that we'll come back to so that just involves laying that out. So basically for homework and whatever, you could be starting. Some people are probably saying, yeah, keep on yapping. I've already got my first one done while you're talking away here. Great then. But what I'm expecting people to have done, again, you don't have to hand them in yet. That date is in the module, and we've got time. But as I say, for homework, you can hopefully cut and score your rhythmic pleating and get your circles all cut and curled and ready to be photographed. And we'll talk about that in class, but basically you'll try to find a nice lighting that kind of maybe top lights them from one side, shine a lamp, get over top of them. You know, you'll want to get them so that you're kind of square to them. You know, I can't get far enough away and I don't want to bounce the camera around, but we'll go over that as we go. And then you'll photograph them in a good lighting that really features the light and shadow. And you should have those two done, and as I say, get this one laid out, at least the grid, and, you know, maybe on a scrap piece of paper, start playing with some of the variations. And as you saw from our samples, you can have curved lines. Everything doesn't have to revolve around an X, but I've just done a couple of the basic ones that I will demonstrate when I come to the next little video. I try to suggest that people get at least 2 different motifs, and then you decide how it's laid out throughout this grid. It could be symmetrical, it could be more asymmetrical. You don't want, you know, as you saw, some people, you know, just did the same thing on all of them. They just did the X cut and the scoring and folded them out, and everyone was the same. That's a little boring. That's a little too highly unified. Probably, you know, you're not going to get quite full marks for that, even if it's neat and tidy. I'll say, yeah, you know, you should have tried a couple of different motifs in there. There's no limit. Well, I guess 16 is the limit. But as you saw, there was one person who did 16 different motifs. Then the challenge is to keep it from just becoming, you know, too chaotic. They did all right with it. And as I say, if somebody takes the time to try all of those wonderful different motifs, I'm not going to worry about how that affects the overall layout. I'm just going to say, great job trying all those interesting things. Then it becomes more like a sampler rather than this overall piece.